Now, we're going to see the consequences of David's sin. You'll want to have his family tree right in front of you. Find Amnon and Tamar. Amnon, firstborn son, the presumed heir to the throne. You see in there?
Amnon.
A couple of people over. Tamar, his half-sister. Amnon lusts after Tamar. One day, he pretends to be ill and asks her to bake him some of her special cakes to help him feel better. When she brings them into him, in his bed, he rapes her. Afterward, she begs him to at least erase her dishonor by marrying her. That was the custom of the day. But now that Amnon's lust has been satisfied, he feels nothing but disgust for her and kicks her out the door. When David hears about this, he is, quote, very angry. What does he do? Nothing. Tamar has a full brother, Absalom. Find Absalom's name right next to Tamar. Same mother. Absalom is known as the most handsome man in all of Israel. That's something that the writer doesn't say about Saul or David. Absalom is especially famous for his shampoo commercial hair. It's long, it's thick, it's luxurious. It weighs 5 pounds. He publicly weighs it on a scale in order to impress people. Absalom, the incredibly handsome, waits and plots for 2 years to avenge the violence against his sister. He invites all his siblings to a sheep shearing party at a time when David can't go, waits until Amnon has had plenty to drink, and orders his servants to kill him. Then Absalom runs away to go live with his mother's father, the king of Geshur. David is devastated. But very quickly, he longs to reach out to Absalom and restore the relationship. What does David do? Nothing. After 3 years, David is persuaded to let Absalom know that he may return to Jerusalem. Absalom returns and longs for reconciliation with his father. David doesn't see him. What does David do? Nothing. For 2 more years, Absalom waits to hear from his father in Jerusalem. Absalom finally burns down Joab's fields in an attempt to get a little attention. And Joab talks David into reconciling with Absalom. Here, we see David's parenting at its worst. Okay, so part of this story is David's desire to have mercy on his children, like he wants to have mercy on everyone. Part of this is a sense of humility. I sinned, so who am I to judge? But mostly, this isn't mercy or humility. This is sheer neglect. He has too many wives and too many children to give any of them the barest fraction of his attention. And all of them, David, the wives, the children, are suffering for it. Incidentally, does David ever write a love song for any of them? No. Any of the wives, any of the children? He wrote one for Saul and Jonathan. David loves his children. We'll see evidence of that later on. But he completely fails to discipline them, and all too often completely fails to engage with them, minimally. We're not in David's situation, but how about us? Can we go out of our way to reconnect with one of our children? Make time for our grandchildren? Let our husband or wife know how much they are loved. Absalom will not forgive his father's cold shoulder and years of neglect. He begins plotting to take the throne from David. He starts going on with chariots and a bodyguard of 50 men running in front of his personal chariot. He makes himself look important. He meets with petitioners at the city gate seeking justice and tells them, "Oh, I feel for you. I would rule in your favor if only I were king." For 4 years, he does this. What does David do? Nothing. So Absalom gathers his supporters and declares himself king at Hebron, where David got his start a generation ago. To avoid bloodshed and destruction in Jerusalem, David retreats from the city. Absalom marches in triumph through the streets of Jerusalem, enters the palace, and seats himself on his father's throne. This is a foolish, foolish thing for Absalom to do. He just raised his hand against the Lord's anointed. I'm reminded of what the prophet Samuel said to Saul a few classes back. Rebellion is as a sin of witchcraft. Absalom's rebellion against David is a picture of our rebellion against God. Even on a purely practical level, this is a foolish, foolish thing for Absalom to do. If you look at his family tree, you'll see he's next in line for the throne anyway. Amnon was number 1. He's dead. Absalom killed him. Number 2, Abigail's son. Seems to have died young. We never hear about that son. We never hear about Abigail again. I hypothesize that she died young. Almost certainly the child did. So we're down to Absalom. Absalom's next in line. Although David has promised the throne to no one at this point, as far as we can tell. And David is getting close to the end of his life. Why is Absalom doing this? I think it's worth pointing out the spiritual warfare aspect of this story. Satan attacks the hardest, where God is most powerfully at work. God has declared that one of David's descendants will be the Messiah. Do you think perhaps Satan is attacking David's family with everything he's got? Yeah, I absolutely think that's part of the picture here. And yet, God will fulfill his promises. Let's take a closer look at David. A lot of time has passed since David and Bathsheba. Big time jump here. It takes years and years and years for the slow story of Absalom's rebellion to unfold. David is somewhere around his mid-60s. In our day and age, that's not old age, but in his time it is. And he's lived a physically demanding life. David is going to die, we know, of old age at age 70. Frail and completely worn out. We can safely assume that even now his health is beginning to fail. He's got to know his time is beginning to draw to a close. He's experiencing powerlessness at every level. And now, he's once again a fugitive in the wilderness. David and Jesus have innumerable things in common. Born in Bethlehem, anointed to lead Israel, tested in the wilderness, shepherd king, man of mercy, escaped death innumerable times. But now, David is about to walk Jesus's Via Dolorosa, his way of the cross. And in his suffering, David will be purified, and he will resemble Jesus more closely than he ever has before. As David and his supporters leave Jerusalem, David walks barefoot like a penitent. He covers his head and weeps. Everyone around him does the same. And then, the text says, they cross the Kidron Valley and begin to ascend the Mount of Olives. Does anyone know what this spot is 1,000 years in the future? Yes. Gethsemane. It's the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus and his followers, 1,000 years later, will leave the Last Supper singing a psalm and go out to the Mount of Olives and walk there to pray. Jesus is going to sweat blood there and say, I'm sorrowful to the point of death. David is practicing Jesus' walk 1,000 years ahead of time. As David is walking through what will be the garden, a messenger comes up and tells him, you have been betrayed. Your most brilliant advisor, your trusted friend Ahithophel, has gone over to the enemy. Ahithophel is David's longtime friend and advisor. It said that his instruction was so wise that David started listening to him, probably instead of to the prophets. And what is Ahithophel's first advice to Absalom? Sleep with your father's concubines in full daylight so everyone knows the throne belongs to you. Remember last week how we talked about this was the custom of the day. If you slept with one of the king's wives, you're declaring yourself king. Absalom decides he's going to do just that. Yeah, in this case, it's his stepmother's. So Absalom pitches a tent on the roof of the palace, right where David first spied on Bathsheba, and sleeps with the 10 concubines David left behind to keep the house. In a supreme irony, it seems that Ahithophel is Bathsheba's grandfather. Is this payback of a twisted sort? Has he been plotting it for years? We don't know. When Ahithophel's plan to defeat David for good, and he almost did it, is foiled by one of David's spies, Ahithophel goes and hangs himself. It's striking. It's the only premeditated suicide in the entire Old Testament. Ahithophel is the picture of Judas. Ahithophel is the traitor who goes and hangs himself. Next, on their way out of Jerusalem, David and his followers encounter Shimei. Shimei is a Benjaminite of the tribe of Saul, and he has never accepted David as king. His allegiance belongs to a different king. Shimei throws rocks at David and his followers and showers David with insults. You're smiling, James. You see where I'm going with this? Shimei shouts, "Begone, you man of blood," and 10 million variations on that line. Abishai, Joab's brother, reaches for a sword and says to David, "Let me cut off his head." And David says, "Put down your sword, Peter." No, he doesn't say that. Actually, he says, "What have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah?" If Shimei is cursing because the Lord has said, "Curse David," who am I to stop him? Leave him alone. Maybe the Lord has ordered him to do this. It may be that the Lord will look upon my affliction and repay me with good. This is a different David than the David we saw 40 years ago. This is not the cocky David and Goliath. This is not David in the wilderness going, "I am innocent, O Lord." No. David completely accepts God's sovereign will here in a way that he didn't 40 years earlier. David accepts the insults. David accepts the rocks. In accepting his suffering, he unites himself to the passion of Christ in his insults and his scourging. Finally, the time has come for the battle against Absalom. David wants to go out and fight, but his own men insist he stay behind and keep himself safe. So David tells everyone, the full army, "Spare the life of my son." But when Absalom is riding away on his mule, his hair gets caught in a tree branch, and he is trapped, suspended over the ground by his amazing hair. None of David's soldiers will touch him. They know better. But Joab stabs him in the heart. David sees 2 messengers running up to meet him, and he shouts to the first, "What news?" The messenger runs up to David and says, "Good news, the Lord has delivered you this day from all who rose up against you." "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" David asks. And the messenger thinks about David's relationship with previous messengers and goes, there's a second messenger coming over the hill right now. How about I give him a turn?" The second messenger runs up to David and says, "Good news, the Lord has delivered you this day from all who rose up against you. Is it well with the young man Absalom?" When David hears that Absalom is dead, he utters a heart-wrenching wail and retreats to his tent. "Oh, my son, Absalom, my son, Absalom. Would that I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." David does not regard the sins of his son. David wants to sacrifice his own life for him. In David's self-sacrificial love, he comes closest to the cross, closest to the heart of Jesus. It's there that we see that redemptive suffering in David. It's going to come to full flower in Jesus. And then, back to the brutal real world. Joab steps in the room, sees David weeping and wailing, and starts shouting at him, "You are a disgrace. You love those who hate you, and you hate those who love you. Joab doesn't get it. But Joab's a realist, and he gets one thing. He tells David, if you don't get out there right now and thank your soldiers for saving your life, you're not going to have a man left in the army by tomorrow morning. Joab's right. David knows he's right. David picks himself up on the ground, gets out there, stands in front of his troops, and begins the business of uniting Israel again. The rebellion of Absalom ends in general forgiveness. David pardons Shimei the rock thrower. David pardons Mephibosheth and Ziba, like I talked about earlier. David gives great gifts to Barzillai and all the other people that gave food and shelter to his troops when they were out in the field. David even pardons Joab. The rest of the story, I'll tell very quickly. It's in chapter 20. After Joab kills Absalom, David fires him. And David hires, of all people, Amasa. He's on your list. Amasa's his nephew, son of Abigail. Son of Abigail, his sister. Amasa is Absalom's general. David hires him in Joab's place. Immediately after the rebellion with Absalom comes another rebellion. Israel, the northern tribes, break away from David, and they're led by a man named Sheba. David sends Amasa, his new general, down to muster the men of Judah, David's tribe, to go and fight Sheba and reunite Israel once again. Well, Amasa was ordered to come back after 3 days, but after 3 days, he's nowhere to be seen. So Joab goes up to the northern kingdom on his own, manages to negotiate the execution of Sheba, and wins the war personally. And he kills Amasa. Joab, just like he did to Abner way back when, during the last Civil War, Joab takes his knife and stabs Amasa in the belly. And then goes back to David and goes back to Jerusalem. And it doesn't say specifically whether David hired him back as his military commander, but quite frankly, I suspect at that point David had a little choice. Joab is in command of the army. David is frail. David is on his last legs. David doesn't have the power anymore to lead Israel the way he used to, the way he would like to. In David's maturity, we see incredible patience in suffering. We see incredible acceptance of his powerlessness, as Jesus accepted humility to die on the cross. David is accepting his own very human level powerlessness. He may be king, but now he's having any shred of arrogance just flushed out of him. He shows that he's even willing to suffer for love of others. And he shows that he's got a firm hope that God knows what he's doing and that God is still at work. He doesn't say, it's up to me to kill Absalom. It's up to me to stick with Jerusalem. No. David trusts that God is going to keep his promises. Also, in older David, we see even greater, more extravagant mercy. I want to follow up on what you said. You were saying that it's so much easier to read the Bible when you've got some kind of interpretive study going on. Right. So, yeah, by all means, keep attending this class. But here are the two commentaries I came to most often. If you want to do more reading on David, here you go. This one is the Ignatius Catholic Study Bible. The notes are basically written by Scott Hahn. It gives a couple of pages at the beginning talking about how 1st and 2nd Samuel were written, where they came from. Then it's got all kind of notes at the bottom talking about, who were the Ziphites? Who is Ahimelech the Hittite? Why doesn't David return when Saul says, return my son? Because he's not an idiot. Word studies. What does the covenant mean? So all kinds of little interpretive notes along the way. This is good. The full Ignatius Catholic Study Bible, unfortunately, is not out yet. It's only in book-by-book form. The entire New Testament is out. The Old Testament isn't. For a life application study, how many of you have ever read Max Lucado?
I have the Bible.
Oh, you have the Max Lucado Study Bible. Wonderful. Here is Max Lucado's take on David, Facing Your Giants. He goes episode by episode through David's life and humanizes David's story, pulls out the life lessons for us, and really helps us see what's going on there. So, easy read. So, those are my two top recommendations.